to establish a subgenre. Okay, so the fear of dolls is called paediophobia, and it's the product of a large and persistent mythology of the living doll, and it's built upon oral testimonies and real experiences. So one notorious example is Robert the Doll, an urban legend surrounding a 19th century doll belonging to the Otto family. Tales tell of him moving between rooms in the night and maniacally giggling. Even now, Robert is housed in a museum where you have to ask his permission to take his photo or suffer his wrath. I think we're okay just looking at it. And another infamous case is that of Annabelle the doll, and she's now contained in a museum as well, that of the famous demonologist Lorraine Warren. A simple rag doll, Annabelle is also reputed to have moved around between rooms in the night, leaving notes for her owners and even attacking them. So these dolls are considered to be malicious and murderous, and these stories have constructed a long-standing tradition which combines legend and truth, and as evident by their own respective Wikipedia entries, one which has saturated popular culture. So as Peter Hutchings argues, urban legends always mean something. So what do these particular urban legends mean? The answer to this question may lie in cinema. For these museums have been unable to contain their dolls, and they've spilled out onto the screen. Key examples include the aptly titled Dolls in 1987, the story of young Judy, who's stranded in the countryside in the mansion of the Hawthorns, with her cruel father and stepmother, 2 screeching punk girls, and a kind-hearted man named Ralph. The unlikely ensemble finds not just one doll, but an entire army of dolls created by the Hawthorns, and horror ensues. And only a year later, the most notorious killer doll franchise, the Child's Play franchise, began, as has now become a well-known narrative, possessed by the late serial killer Charles Lee Ray, a good guy doll named Chucky, violently pursues and attempts to transfer his soul into a boy named Andy. The 4th through 6th films depart from Andy and shift their focus to Chucky, and then his bride, Tiffany, and even their doll child in Seed of Chucky. I even believe a 7th instalment is now on its way, so that's something to look forward to. Chucky is so infamous a monster that he even made it into the top 10 film villains for Radio Times. So his fame doesn't only speak to the living doll's filmic tradition, but the character was reportedly also inspired by Robert the Doll. So we've come full cycle between film, fiction, and its real origins. And this adaptation of a popular story is similar to that of The Conjuring, a recent horror film which reworked the myth of Annabelle. The grotesque wooden-painted doll, instead of a rag doll here, Annabelle, made such an impression on its audience that it warranted its own prequel in 2014. And Annabelle, the fictional account of Mia and John Form's encounter with the doll, was released in 2014 to become one of the highest-grossing horror films of all time. Even lesser-known films, such as May and Kathy's Curse, or in the last 2 years, The Boy and Robert, have something to offer. So even though they don't have the fame of Child's Play, they still reflect the popular and visual qualities of the living doll in a way which can enhance its exploration. But I won't necessarily have time to discuss them in any depth here, so I'll be focusing on Dolls, Annabelle, and Child's Play, which sort of spans the gap between the two. Okay, so one would think that given the living doll's prolific place in cinema, it would have received much critical consideration. But actually, scholarly attention has been quite negligent. While some notable critics have acknowledged its place briefly, others have ignored it completely. Bruce Carwin's Horror in the Horror film sets out with the goal of creating a complete description of horror, including every subgenre and sub-subgenre of monster there is. So this includes plants and even minerals, but somehow dolls are omitted. They're not worthy of a mention. In the Ashgate Encyclopedia of Monsters, dolls are mentioned, at least, but it's significant that they're included under the category objects animate, so they're not worthy of their own entry. And instead, their categorization implies the living doll is no different than a talking teacup or the car Christine. It results in a very generalized account of their effect upon the audience. And from the use of words such as ambivalence and unsettling, I would argue that it's the uncanny to which these critical forays into the living doll allude to. This is supported by Nicholas Royle's account of the uncanny, in which he explains that the sensation can be felt in response to dolls and other lifelike or mechanical objects. Royle makes this explicit, but in doing so, he reduces it to one line. So, although in accounts of the living doll of the uncanny is alluded to but barely explored, in explorations of the uncanny, the doll is included as a foregone conclusion, but left at that. So this means it's necessary not just to interrogate the living doll, but the concept of the uncanny itself. It's a theory seemingly well established since Ernst Jentsch's 1906 essay. And here Jentsch explains the uncanny by arguing that someone to whom something uncanny happens is not quite at home or at ease in the situation, that the thing is, or at least seems to be, foreign to him. He then explicitly links this sensation to dolls, arguing that doubt as to whether a lifeless object may not in fact be animate is one of the most powerful situations of the uncanny. And critics seem to have accepted Jentsch's claim without question, yet it's not without its problems. For example, within the very same essay, Jentsch expands that a doll which closes and opens its eyes by itself, or a small automatic toy, will cause no notable sensation of this kind. Yet these are the dolls most commonly featured in the horror films. In Dolls, they're very small dolls, not life-size, and in Chucky, he particularly appears to be mechanical at first, with recorded catchphrases and basic movements. So Jentsch's account alone is not enough to satisfy the quest to find out why dolls are so frightening. Perhaps Freud can assist then, in demonstrating where the doll is situated in the uncanny valley, for example, and the reason we fear it. Freud builds upon Jentsch's account, which for him, while rich in content, is not exhaustive. Instead, he seeks to clarify further what this sensation is, and finds its semantic origins leave no doubt that it belongs to the realm of the frightening, and also that dolls, such as Olympia from The Sandman, have an element of the uncanny. However, despite this more complete account, Freud's description of the uncanny also remains problematic. This is because for Freud, the motif of the doll, Olympia, is by no means the only one responsible for the incomparably uncanny effect of the story, or even the one to which it is principally due. According to this account, animated dolls are, quote, quite irrelevant compared to truly uncanny elements, such as losing one's eyes. Thus, where for Jentsch, small dolls are not uncanny, and for Freud, dolls are not a strong example of the uncanny, as a consequence, neither truly substantiates the claim that dolls horrify us simply because they are animate, inanimate objects. Moreover, if we're searching for the reason the living doll horrifies us, we must distinguish between terror and horror. And in doing so, we find that the uncanny becomes even less satisfactory. This is because not only do Jentsch and Freud's accounts of the uncanny prove dismissive of the dolls in these films, but they also allude to the realm of the frightening rather than the horrifying. The uncanny is unsettling and displeasing, but more must be said of the gore and repulsion that these films evoke through images like these. Significantly, Royle does allude to some of these more sickening features in his work on the uncanny, arguing that it can be a matter of the grotesque, things like death and corpses, cannibalism, the return of the dead. But in this way, it is a crisis of the proper and natural. It disturbs any straightforward sense of what is inside and what is outside. And here it actually resembles another branch of theory used in horror, Julia Kristeva's concept of abjection, suggesting another potential methodology. Kristeva argues that, essentially different from uncanniness, more violent too, abjection is elaborated through a failure to recognize its kin. Nothing is familiar, not even the shadow of a memory. The sensation of the abject makes us gag, it repulses us, reflecting the more nauseating experience of the living doll in the horror film. And the abject becomes an even more appealing methodology when a close analysis of the films reveals the recurring place of the mother and the monstrous-feminine, which is so central to abjection. As Barbara Creed notes, although Kristeva's study is concerned with psychoanalysis and literature, it nevertheless suggests a way of situating the monstrous feminine in the horror film in relation to the maternal figure and abjection, and both Creed and Kristeva can provide valuable insights here. And Lewis Kuznets links the relationship between girl and doll to mother and child also, a temptingly simple premise, only to argue that closer examination points to the oversimplification embodied in the girl as mother, doll as child formula. when examined more closely in the horror film, the living doll is indeed far too complex to be reduced to this formula. Indeed, we must also look at the mothers of young protagonists, at adult women as mother to the doll, at doll as mother, and at birth itself. So firstly, in the Child's Play franchise, Andy can be considered as both victim and villain, begging for the good guy doll only to be attacked by it. And in relation, his mother is also victimised and villainised when she buys the contaminated Chucky doll in an alleyway. The gesture reflects the doll's place as a material bargaining tool almost, designed to please the child and as an act of compensation for any of the mother's failures. In Child's Play, the absence of a father figure. As Sarah Arnold argues, horror cinema remains preoccupied with the figure of the mother, particularly the bad mother. And Andy's mother's failure deepens as, single and struggling, she must then work on her son's birthday, and one of her friends must stand in. But it's this evening that Chucky begins his quest to possess Andy, both his bad mother and his proxy mother failing him, the latter suffering the consequences. By Child's Play 2, Andy's mother is completely absent, having been locked away in a psychiatric ward. His foster mother offers a replacement, tucking him into bed, and it's clear from her beloved statue of a mother and child that she's performing her own desires for children on Andy. This statue has been passed from mother to mother in her family, ending with her, so it's implied that she's barren. Thus, the image of Chucky smashing this statue is a symbolic act of violence against all mothers, and it foreshadows the way in which Chucky will murder every maternal figure in Andy's life, slitting his foster mother's throat and stabbing Grace, the social worker who takes Andy in. Therefore, the living toy can be both bargaining tool and downfall of the mother, two abject branches of the monstrous feminine, in which mother is morally corrupt and mother is corpse. The latter may especially remind us of Kristeva's alignment of mother and death, both abominated, abjected and objecting. Judy also suffers from an absent mother and failure of a stepmother in Dolls. Judy's evil stepmother soon gets her comeuppance at the hands of the dolls, and this not only protects an ideal of childhood, but also reinforces traditional concepts of motherhood. So differently to Child's Play, the absent mother of Dolls is depicted from far as perfect, in line with the fairy tale ending Judy deserves. Back in America, she presents the antithesis to Rosemary, and even offers a happy ending for Ralph, as Judy implies she will set them up. But to complicate this binary between stepmother and mother, we must also consider the witch Hilary, who acts maternally towards Judy. Hilary is shown bending unnervingly close to Judy, encroaching upon her in a motherly yet oddly threatening manner. More than this, she's seen strolling the house at night with a pram, only to have a close-up reveal a frightening doll in its depths, illuminated by a flash of lightning. Such a jarring image suggests an unnatural act of displaced motherhood, in which Mia... Such a jarring image suggests an unnatural act of displaced motherhood, in which not only the children who come to her house are figured as her children, but also her beloved dolls, allowing an aged woman to reenact her maternal instincts with dangerous consequences. Not just a failed mother, Hilary is closer to what Arnold describes as malevolent and violent, and the maternal instinct is figured as corrupting. In Annabelle, it's actually the father, John, who brings the doll into the home as a present for his pregnant wife and their unborn child. This in itself does not bring the living doll into the home, however, as the doll's possession happens after John has purchased it. Instead, the possession takes place when the neighbour's daughter, upon returning from a cult, murders her mother, then completes her sacrilege by coming to John and Mia's home to commit suicide whilst holding the doll in her arms. In doing so, her abominable act of matricide and suicide unleashes a demon in the doll who will stop at nothing to possess the soul of Mia's unborn child. Thus begins a film constantly preoccupied with motherhood, and shortly after, another cult member stabs Mia's pregnant stomach. Such an act of violence advertently inverts pregnancy, the weapon unnaturally entering the womb, outer becoming inner. And following this sequence, editing is used to juxtapose a television montage of the crime scene with Mia's ultrasound, visually linking violence and pregnancy. These events are shortly followed by a fire caused by the doll demon, which induces Mia's labour, the unnatural trigger of which makes outer, inner in an accelerated abject display. Mia must then protect her child at every turn, while the television in the background shows images of emergency services for children, creating a perpetual underlying sense of threat. As the film descends into the apartment's basement, the presentation of motherhood itself is presented as the abomination. In this darkened cellar, a pram emerges. In this darkened cellar, a pram emerges, and the sound of a screaming baby echoes throughout the room. Just as in Dolls, the audience must watch fearfully as the camera closes in on the pram. But instead of a baby or even a doll, it's a demon's arm which emerges. The pram operates as a strange space, one which we are invited to look into, but at the same time are very afraid of what we might see there. In this way, it echoes the womb itself, the pregnant stomach we see at the beginning of Annabelle, as well as the very setting of the basement. Furthermore, this scene is reminiscent of Rosemary's Baby, Rosemary pulling aside the fabric of the pram only to cry, "What have you done?" to its eyes. It's no coincidence that John and Mia share their names with Mia Farrow and John Cassavetes. Indeed, the comparison between Annabelle and Rosemary's Baby is an important one, as the latter breaks down the distinction between the self and the other by making the body permeable. This gross permeability necessitates a more thorough contemplation of the theme of pregnancy, as it pervades not only Annabelle, but also the later instalments of the Child's Play franchise. It begins with Bride of Chucky, in which Tiffany and Chucky have sex upon discovering that they are anatomically correct. Despite Chucky's jest that he is made of rubber, the film nonetheless ends with Tiffany's giving birth. Tiffany is badly burnt and presumed dead, but a PI approaches the doll, only to find that she is still alive and screaming. Underneath her dress, her stomach stretches and moves, until finally an explosion of blood hits the investigator in the face. This gory birth aligns with Kristeva's theory of the abject and is reminiscent of the chestburster in Alien as well. It's similar to Kristeva's theory in which evocation of the maternal body and childbirth induces the image of birth as a violent act of expulsion, through which the nascent body tears itself away from the matter of the maternal insides. What emerges is also alien-like, a baby doll far removed from the commercial variety, the image I showed you earlier. It's monstrous and smeared in blood and reveals sharp fangs. And it's the most monstrous of the living doll depictions, perhaps because it's not just a doll which is brought to life, but one which is born an abomination. It is a clear visual example of how, in the horror film, the ancient connection drawn between woman, womb, and monstrous is frequently invoked. These themes continue into Seed of Chucky, with opening credits which play upon Look Who's Talking, but here depicting sperm travelling through tunnels, which are also reminiscent of the chasms of blood and rubber in the opening of Child's Play 3. In this instalment, Tiffany and Chucky hatch a plot to inseminate a human host so that they can have their souls transferred into an entire family. They bring together the doll and the human here in another freshly disturbing biological synthetic synthesis. Tiffany provides Chucky with a cup, flashing her plastic breasts at him in an odd suggestion of dolls, sexuality, and a desire for motherhood. Indeed, it's she who inseminates Jennifer Tilly, looming over her separated legs with a pipette which drips as she squeezes it. More bodily fluids are at work in this scene. By making the private inner space of fertilization an outer public one, the film creates an abject effect, the same gag-inducing abject effect of the exterior womb created in Cronenberg's The Brood, for example. And following this grotesque insemination, Tilly suffers an equally grotesque pregnancy, accelerated over one day. She awakens at full term the next morning and must then give birth to not just one, but two bloodied babies. Reminiscent of the birth in Bride of Chucky, the birth happens quickly and bloodily, with unpleasant sound effects, an exaggerated example of how woman's ability to give birth links her directly to the animal world and to the great cycle of birth, decay, and death. Moreover, the passing of the newborn baby into the doll's arms directly links Tiffany as another participant in the cycle of birth, decay, and death. She shows that the living doll is not just baby, but also mother, representing the monstrous feminine in all senses. So although I've not had space here to discuss all of the films in the subgenre, having watched them, if I were to raise them here, they would raise strikingly similar points. Nor have I had the space to consider the uncanny in as much detail as warrants, as it shouldn't simply be dismissed. But I have concluded that considering the living doll as uncanny alone is not sufficient to explain its reign of horror, as it's also steeped in the abject, and exploring the latter reveals another persistent facet of the monstrous feminine.